Chapter 6. New Life Forms. From the goo to you via the zoo? In grammar school, they taught me that a frog turning into a prince was a fairy tale. In the university, they taught me that a frog turning into a prince was a fact. Ron Carlson. In the movie Contact, Jodie Foster plays a scientist who is part of the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence SETI research team. SETI, which is a real organization, has scientists who scan space for unmistakable signs of intelligent life. What constitutes an unmistakable sign of intelligent life? A message. That's right, something like, "Take out the garbage, Mom." In the movie, Foster gets extremely excited when her antenna picks up radio waves that appear to have an intelligent pattern. 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. "Those are primes," she exclaims, meaning prime numbers. "That can't be natural phenomena." Indeed, random radio waves can be naturally produced, but those that contain a message always have an intelligent source. Prime numbers from 1 to 101 in order constitute a message that only comes from an intelligent being. Foster is so confident that ET has been found, she goes public with her discovery. Government and military officials then converge on her facility. "If this is such an intelligent source, then why don't they just speak English?" one official asks with a hint of derision. "Because math is the only universal language," Foster fires back. Of course she's right. In fact, alphabets, and thus language itself, can be ultimately reduced to numbers. This is why the English alphabet is mathematically identical to the genetic alphabet of DNA, and why the comparison of cell information to encyclopedias is a one-to-one relationship rather than just an analogy. While Foster and her colleagues later discover a more complicated message embedded in the radio waves, they are absolutely certain the prime numbers alone prove that the message came from intelligent life. Why are they so certain of this? Because repeated observation tells us that only intelligent beings create messages, and that natural laws never do. When we see a sequence of prime numbers, we realize that it requires an intelligent cause, just like the messages "Take out the garbage, Mom" and "Mary loves Scott" do. Ironically, Contact was based on a novel by the late Carl Sagan, an ardent evolutionist who believed in spontaneous generation, and who was instrumental in starting the real SETI program. The irony lies in the fact that Sagan was absolutely convinced that a simple string of prime numbers proves the existence of an intelligent being, but the equivalent of 1,000 encyclopedias in the first one-celled life does not. It takes a lot of faith not to believe in God, more than we have. Moreover, it was Sagan who wrote this about the human brain. The information content of the human brain, expressed in bits, is probably comparable to the total number of connections among the neurons, about 100 trillion bits. If written out in English, say, that information would fill some 20 million volumes, as many as in the world's largest libraries. The equivalent of 20 million books is inside the heads of every one of us. The brain is a very big place in a very small space. The neurochemistry of the brain is astonishingly busy. The circuitry of a machine more wonderful than any devised by humans. Actually, Sagan probably underestimated the brain's information content at 20 million books. Nevertheless, the figure is still stunning. To conceptualize it, picture yourself at center court of Madison Square Garden several hours before a basketball game. You are the only one in the arena, and you are looking at almost 20,000 empty seats all around you. How many books would you have to stack on each seat in order to fit 20 million books in that arena? You would need to stack 1,000 books on each and every seat to fit 20 million books in Madison Square Garden. Think about that. The roof is not high enough to allow that many books. You'd have to blow off the roof and keep stacking. That's how much specified and complex information is between your ears. Sagan was indeed right that the brain is a very big place in a very small space, and it's something immeasurably more sophisticated than anything humans have ever created. Now let's review the facts. Sagan realized that the human brain has the information content of 20 million books. He also realized that's drastically more specified and complex than a string of prime numbers. Then why did he think the simpler message required an intelligent being, but not the one 20 million books long? We might also ask Sagan and his fellow Darwinists a question of similar weight. If intelligent human beings can't create anything close to the human brain, why should we expect non-intelligent natural laws to do so? The Darwinist response will usually involve natural selection. Is this sufficient to account for new life forms? After all, it's a long way from one cell to the human brain. What about new life forms? Before discussing the origin of new life forms, we need to revisit the problem of the origin of first life. It certainly is a long way from one cell to the human brain, but the journey may be even longer from non-living chemicals to the first cell. That's the most difficult problem for Darwinists. Where did the first life come from? Do you see the magnitude of this problem for Darwinists? If Darwinists don't have an explanation for the first life, then what's the point of speaking about new life forms? The process of macroevolution, if it's possible at all, can't even begin unless there's pre-existing life. But as we saw in the last chapter, this doesn't stop the Darwinists. Against all empirical and forensic evidence, Darwinists make up a just-so story, spontaneous generation or panspermia, that magically gives them the first life they need. This isn't science, this is a joke. In fact, it reminds us of a joke. Steve Martin used to say, "I know how you can be a millionaire and never pay taxes. First, get $1 million. Okay, now." The Darwinist position is even more problematic when you consider that they don't even have an explanation for the source of the non-living chemicals, much less an explanation for life. As we saw in Chapter 3, one of the most profound questions to ask is, if there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing at all? We saw that the atheists have no plausible answer to this question. Suggesting a possibility is not enough. They have to present evidence if they are going to be scientific. It's obvious they don't know where the universe came from. A good box-top worldview should be able to plausibly explain all of the data. If it can't answer the fundamental questions of the origin of the world or the origin of life, it's not a viable box-top. It's time to look for a new one. Even though we see that the Darwinist box-top is fundamentally flawed, we need to look at a few of the claims the Darwinists make regarding the origin of new life forms. Their theory is macroevolution. Microevolution versus macroevolution. You remember macroevolution, from the goo to you via the zoo. It's the belief that all life forms have descended from a common ancestor, the first one-celled creature, and all of this has happened by natural processes without any intelligent intervention. God was not involved. It has been a completely blind process. Darwinists say that this has happened by natural selection, but the term natural selection is a misnomer. Since the process of evolution is, by definition, without intelligence, there is no selection at all going on. It's a blind process. The term natural selection simply means that the fittest creatures survive. So what? That's true by definition. The fittest survive. This is called tautology, a circular argument that doesn't prove anything. Logically, these are the creatures that are best equipped genetically or structurally to deal with changing environmental conditions. That's why they survive. As an example of natural selection, consider what happens to bacteria attacked by antibiotics. When bacteria survive a bout with antibiotics and multiply, that surviving group of bacteria may be resistant to that antibiotic. The surviving bacteria are resistant to that antibiotic because the parent bacteria possessed the genetic capacity to resist, or a rare biochemical mutation somehow helped it survive. We say rare because mutations are nearly always harmful. Since the sensitive bacteria die, the surviving bacteria multiply and now dominate. Darwinists say that the surviving bacteria have evolved. Having adapted to the environment, the surviving bacteria provide us with an example of evolution. Fair enough, but what kind of evolution? The answer we're about to give is absolutely critical. In fact, outside of the philosophical presuppositions we've been exposing, defining evolution is perhaps the greatest point of confusion in the creation-evolution controversy. This is where Darwinian errors and false claims begin to multiply like bacteria, if not checked by those who believe observation is important to science. Here's what observation tells us. These surviving bacteria always stay bacteria. They do not evolve into another type of organism. That would be macroevolution. Natural selection has never been observed to create new types. But macroevolution is exactly what Darwinists claim from the data. They say that these observable micro-changes can be extrapolated to prove that unobservable macroevolution has occurred. They make no distinction between microevolution and macroevolution, and thus use the evidence for micro to prove macro. By failing to make this critical distinction, Darwinists can dupe the general public into thinking that any observable change in any organism proves that all life has evolved from the first one-celled creature. This is why it is essential that the right distinctions be made, and that all hidden assumptions be exposed when discussing the creation-evolution controversy. So if someone ever asks you, "Do you believe in evolution?" you should ask that person, "What do you mean by evolution? Do you mean micro or macroevolution?" Microevolution has been observed, but it cannot be used as evidence for macroevolution, which has never been observed. Darwinists are masters at defining the term evolution broadly enough so that evidence in one situation might be counted as evidence in another. Unfortunately for them, the public is beginning to catch on to this tactic, thanks largely to the popular works of Berkeley law professor Philip Johnson. Johnson first exposed this Darwinistic sleight of hand with his groundbreaking book Darwin on Trial. That's where he points out none of the proofs for natural selection provides any persuasive reason for believing that natural selection can produce new species, new organs, or other major changes, or even minor changes that are permanent. Biologist Jonathan Wells agrees when he writes, "Biochemical mutations cannot explain the large-scale changes in organisms that we see in the history of life." Why can't natural selection do the job? Here are 5 reasons it can't. 1. Genetic limits. Darwinists say that microevolution within types proves that macroevolution has occurred. If these small changes can occur over a short period of time, think what natural selection can do over a long period of time. Unfortunately for Darwinists, genetic limits seem to be built into the basic types.